Um, Welcome, folks, to 52 Living Ideas. Today is a Saturday. It's a Stoic Saturday. And my friend Joe is here to talk about, carry out the next lesson from Greg's and Massimo's book, the Handbook for New Stoics. So today we're going to be talking about impressions too. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Shrikant, and welcome everyone to week 37, Catch and Examine the Judgments Underlying Your Impressions and Impulses. This is the second week in the Discipline of Assent, which is the Discipline of Assent for anybody that doesn't know, although I assume I know everyone here, where everybody's aware that how we are mindful about our judgments. The other two disciplines, the disciplines of desire, deal with the acceptance of fate and the dichotomy of control. And the discipline of action deals with our interactions with other and our love for mankind in general. But let's get started with this week's quote that will help us put things into context. The quote by Marcus Aurelius' Meditations: Epictetus urged the need of sound grammar, a sound grammar of assent, and in dealing with the impulses, to take good heed to keep them subject to reservation, unselfishness, and due proportion to their object, always to refrain inclination and to limit avoidance to things within our control. So I want to focus on the idea that the sound grammar of assent, basically this is using the idea of logic with our judgments and how to curb our judgments in specific situations and to make rational decisions and reasonable decisions when we feel emotions come up. This helps us and is one of the key Stoic practices, fields of study, with the other two being physics and ethics. So this week's example they give us is somebody that's struggling with anger. And the goal is to limit the impulse of anger within that. And it provides a specific incident where the individual is having to go to a doctor's office and wait for a couple of hours, and they start to feel themselves losing their cool. Using logic, they can identify their initial impressions, and this way they can come to a decision that best addresses the situation as opposed to acting out in anger that would actually make the situation much worse and compromise their tranquility of mind. So Marcus Aurelius actually provides us with a framework in this chapter on how to act on our impulses, and it has to meet three criteria. We have to look at the proportionate issue at hand, the proportion of the issue at hand, whether our reactions are pro-social and subject to reservation. So let's take, for example, the person that's getting upset in the doctor's office. If they're waiting for a couple of hours, it's not really the end of the world if they're looking at it proportionally. So when we start to take this, step back and look at why, we're getting upset, that would help us understand how to react appropriately. Is it pro-social? Yelling at the staff or doing something along those lines would be completely inappropriate, and it really wouldn't generate the outcomes that we want. And is it subject to reservation? Basically, our, keeping us from our serenity of mind, because if we're assuming that the way things should be, then all of a sudden that's not necessarily the best way to think about things. We always should think of things within the reserve clause, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. The next deals with the concept of an impulse. An impulse is to act based on our desire. If we are given a situation and we have this urge to act, and we ought to refrain from our, we're coming back to Marcus Aurelius's quote, we ought to refrain from our inclinations and our immediate desires. We have a tendency to choose things, that we have a predisposition towards. So in the particular case of waiting in the doctor's office, we start to think about things that we shouldn't have to wait this long for a service. And we get very angry as because we have an expectation. And we kind of covered this in week 18, where we have a goal, and then we also premeditate on the idea of what that goal would, if we didn't get the outcomes that we want, how would we behave in a social manner? So coming down to the authors give us four, they break down a way of what to do this week, breaking it down into 4 steps. So the first step is what happens when we don't get what we desire. When we don't get what we desire, it triggers a set of automatic thoughts and initial feelings. So in this case, again, for example, anger stemming from the desire from not having to wait in the doctor's office. The second is the impression about the situation begins to surface. You start to think, I shouldn't have to wait this long. The office staff is incompetent, and we start to make value judgments based on the situation itself. The third is to choose to agree to our automatic thoughts. We can either suspend judgment, or reject our automatic thoughts, which would prevent us from overreacting to a particular situation. And the fourth and final is assenting to our impressions. Basically, assenting to it, we feel the need to argue and argue with the staff as a way of acting out, which actually wouldn't be helpful. So if we don't assent to those impressions and we don't give in to those impressions, it would be optimal. So the first part of the week of this week's lesson is basically we have a graph. If for anybody that doesn't have the book, it lists out a situation, what is presumed to be good or bad, and what you could say to yourself to counter the impression. So the first part, the situation, is they outline as getting angry for the long wait in the doctor's office. The second, the presumption is, well, wasting my time is bad. The third part is it's not a waste of time if I work through my impressions. That would be the way we counter our impression, is the idea of like, it would not, we have an opportunity to practice Stoicism and start to become a way of understanding that not assenting and giving in to our initial impressions. Then there's a second part of the exercise that looks at, uses Marcus Aurelius's framework as it being proportional, pro-social, and properly reserved. Proportional is to put things in perspective. Pro-social is to enhance our social relationships so that we don't argue with anyone. And the third is properly reserved. The reserve clause is always saying fate willing. And if we're saying those types of things, then we're able to better accept when things don't turn out as we had planned. So the reason we're doing this exercise overall is to engage with building, dealing with our impressions, and to expand our practice to include our impulses, which last week we worked on the dichotomy of control. With that, I'll just stop there for a moment.
Do you want to open it up for questions?
For questions.
Okay, folks, if you have questions, clarifications that you want to, if you have read the chapter, if you have any comments about the chapter, you're welcome to make them at this point. In order to do that, just go ahead and type ! In the chat. The same rules as always. Type ! To speak. Keep on topic, be brief, and be courteous. Leslie, followed by Jean next. Leslie, go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, Joe. Could you give an example, like of those 3 questions we ask? Is it pro-social? Is it proportionate? Those are straightforward, or they make sense. But this properly reserved, could you give an example of an impulse with a reserve clause added to it? Is it necessarily a negative impulse? Is it any impulse? Could you give a little detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea that it is any impulse, like essentially if we use a reserve clause, we're always identifying that the situation is outside of our control. So if I always say, I'll be doing this at 4 o'clock, fate permitting, what we do, and by doing that, we start to say to ourselves, okay, we can start to evaluate when our impressions start to arise out of these situations when things don't necessarily go as we plan. So it basically, the example that was given the week 31, I believe that Dan led, was the idea of if the person was going to do something at 4 o'clock and they had plans to pick up their kids, they would say fate permitting. And if the situation was they were unable to do that, then they would be able to say to themselves, okay, that they understood that it was outside their control, that they were late, and the reason why they were getting upset. And it starts to lay the framework for understanding why, you know, how you're going to react to a particular situation. Does that answer your question, or is that a little bit?
I guess it's interesting because I think of the reserve clause as, this is my intention that I will implement unless the world blocks me. That would be a reserve clause. But this is not a reservation on my intention. This is a reservation on my impulse. Is there a difference there?
Well, the reserve clause helps us understand the impulse. So the impulse, then we determine whether we act on it or not. So then it also speaks, and that's kind of where we got to the concept of an impulse as well. Where is it arising from? But I think that this helps us, again, the reserve clause helps us identify that the impulse is coming up and why it's coming up. And then we have a choice whether or not to ascend to it.
Next up is Jean, followed by Dan.
Yeah, it's a great example because I think it's very relatable with this doctor appointment because I ran into it before. So my question is, I wonder, we can control ourselves not saying anything, but I think sometimes I get not very happy with the situation because I don't think it's fair. Because if you're late for the appointment, they will cancel it, but they could hold you wait there for hours. But our time is equally valuable. That's why I like to argue with them. I said, I already wait so long. I have work to do. Not like I can't do the work here. So that's why I think if nobody speak out, I don't think it's fair treatment for the patient. I think nobody speak out, then they will keep doing this. And fair treatment to the patient. I think patient need to speak out to create a fair situation for them. So that's just related to this particular situation. I think people have to, we can control our emotion not to react. But at the same time, when we see the situation unfair, people need to speak out to change the situation. What do you think about that?
I do. I mean, I think that, this is not necessarily saying that you don't speak. It's the idea that what you're doing, and how you react proportionally to the situation. And then obviously in this particular case, that if you're going to get angry and react, that doesn't necessarily benefit anybody. It doesn't benefit the office staff, and it doesn't benefit you. Well, so it kind of gives you a way of engaging with your emotions and other people. And that's where the framework that Marcus Aurelius has laid out, with the idea of it being a proportional, pro-social, and social, how you're going to interact with other people. So that's a really important point. Yeah, you're right. It doesn't tell us not to engage with others, but it does tell us that how to engage with others in a way that we can get along with each other.
Next up is Dan, followed by Rogine. Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. One of my ongoing questions is how to balance between two things. In a situation like this, the doctor's office example has different aspects to it: patience, or speaking out, or even getting upset and ending up on YouTube the next day. How can a Stoic balance these things? Is there another tool that is available?
Can you specify, like, is there another tool that's available on, I think, God, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously the different aspects that you described, like being pro-social, for example, is on one side, and then being patient or is on the other side. There's also anger as a response. There's also maybe just speaking up but being friendly, like offering a suggestion. When there are many choices to choose from, how does the Stoic to choose one or the other?
I mean, I think that And that's a great question, because it's really difficult sometimes to know how to react, because you don't know. There's a lot of unknowns in the situation. You don't necessarily even know what the office staff is going through. They may have a very good reason as to why that is, that they're being delayed for 2 hours. So I think that that's kind of the key, is that to really look at it from a perspective that there are a lot of unknowns in the situation, and to temper your response accordingly. So, I mean, how do you then respond to that? How do you then choose for how to properly respond? I think that almost you would never yell at another person in that type of situation. You would almost, so you started to reduce the number of options that you would not otherwise engage, as opposed to just reacting. You're reacting in a mindful manner. So I think that's so thank you for that question, because I think the idea of reduction of what you would not do is really important in that process.
Next up is Rogine, followed by Mark. Rogine?
Okay, my impulses almost always are to just do nothing, ignore everything, which I think is not to my benefit or pro-social or anything. Does that make sense? So I'm trying to actually, instead of not doing something, I'm trying to do something. Does that make sense?
So by not reacting, meaning you're doing something, is essentially. Let me ask you this: how do you best get to the outcome that you would desire, and that's good for both parties involved?
To be more myself and not just putting up with anything and being silent and giving the impression that I don't care about anything. That's not the outcome I want. My friends are going to be somewhat startled already.
I mean, sometimes not engaging with someone is a decision that actually has an impact on both parties. So it's not necessarily something that it's a non-option. And then in some ways, in order to if it means keeping your tranquility in mind, your peace of mind in mind, so to speak, then that's not a bad reaction to a situation. There's different forms of communicating too. You don't necessarily have to communicate at that specific moment either. So, I mean, there you could call and complain about the doctor's office afterwards or something like that. So when you're feeling more calm. So not reacting is actually a very good option in certain circumstances.
Next up is Mark.
Hi, thanks, Joe. Yeah, to that point about not reacting, I think that underlies some of the Stoic philosophy. You want to assess situations before you react so that you can be more confident that you're taking the right action. So to that topic, I suggest in the chat that ask questions. That serves two purposes. You gain more data so you can see whether the delay may be reasonable. Maybe there's an emergency going on that obviously takes priority. And also, I find in general, people react better to being asked questions rather than being instantly confronted and receiving complaints. I just wonder what your thoughts were on that approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that you're getting as much data as possible to make a decision is, that's logical. So you're applying logic to the situation. It also is an example of when you're looking at any kind of situation, and the authors give us this example in the exercise, is that it's our choice to be there in certain circumstances, right? So that when it is our choice to be there, then it's more about us and not the other individuals involved. You can go to, in most cases, to a different doctor's office if you absolutely are dissatisfied with the way this situation is playing out. But again, I think that your idea of having as much data as possible in order to make a decision first is one that is highly, that's advisable, and to Stoics and pretty much anybody, to be quite honest.
Next up is Deborah.
Hi, thanks.
Hi.
Okay, so I'm kind of linking this to last night. This is also the first section I read of this entire book, so bear with me because I'm taking it as a part and not a whole, so they may answer these questions. So it seems that a lot of this is individually based or kind of like internally based, I guess, like how you react, what you do with yourself, not so much, I mean, maybe somewhat how you interact with other people, but not so much about other people. So I'm wondering, because in the situations that were presented, it seemed very much like, okay, you're playing off of other people, but it's your situation. So if you're sitting in the doctor's office and you're waiting for an appointment, this is how it's affecting you. The other people probably don't care, if you have to wait, or I mean, maybe if someone else is waiting for you at a later appointment, but basically the other people in the waiting room, I mean, unless you're making them wait, it shouldn't really affect them, I guess. So I was wondering, I guess what you think, Joe, or if the book says anything about situations that have to do with intervening on behalf of other people, or if it's supposed to be pro-social. I remember that was one of the things that you mentioned, that more overall social activities, things that have to do with like, affecting other people directly as opposed to just yourself or mainly yourself.
Yeah, I mean, actually, that's a great question, is the idea of when to interject, not only for yourself, but for other people, where you're starting to think that's as much as important as being pro-social as it is to maybe not react, or to not overreact. So when do you say something? And I think that gets back to Dan's point earlier, is like, how do you select from this, a number of choices where, I am going to say something because it's not only just about me, but it's about other people that are in the office. So there are situations that present themselves where we should react. But the book, as far as what the book says specifically, there are chapters about it where when we should be involved socially, and that's a way of essentially be activists in a way. But for this particular chapter, it's more, I think, just about the situation of maintaining your own impulses and reacting in a rational way. So that would be my answer.
Next up is Eileen.
I had a thought while we were discussing this particular comment. I don't know if it's in the book, but what came to mind is if we had premeditated a worst that could happen before we went to this appointment, I think it would probably be common to think, what if I have to wait a long time? So I don't know if that's in this realm of our study, but I know it's come up in other events. So would you say it's part of?
Yeah, and actually the authors call that out. It's week 18 with premeditatio malorum, so that we have this idea of a goal in mind, and then we, premeditate at adverse circumstances, that when we don't necessarily get what we desire, it will actually allow us to react virtuously, which is the first part of the discipline of action. I think it's the first week in the discipline of action. So that this is how we, are pro-social. So yes, premeditatio malorum had a lot of different, and it also directly relates on how we are impacted with our impulses, as well as, proportionally respond to the situation. So I think, yes, premeditation is a critical exercise here that comes into the discipline of assent. This is just adding another layer to it, where we're actually looking at our impulses.
Joe, shall we go to the next section?
Sure. Bear with me 1 second while I just pull up the exercise that I just got. My computer just kind of crashed on me. So anyway, so in the breakout session, we'll just visualize 1 or 2 situations where you would have an unhealthy reaction. An unhealthy reaction would be something like you'd be anxious, sad, hurt, or angry. And then identify what a social reaction would be, where, you know, and a non-social reaction would be, and one that would be a pro-social reaction. So then you can start to have an idea of what, you know, how to react in a particular situation when you get upset, when emotions start to emerge. And then, you know, I think that would actually, that's, you know, we can come back and talk about it afterwards.
Okay, folks, do you have any questions about the exercise itself? If you have any questions about the exercise, you can go ahead and type exclamation mark. Just about the, Peggy, you had a question?
No, but thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so we're going to start for the couple of people who just came in. So we're going to start the breakout rooms now, and we're going to run the breakout rooms for about 25 minutes, where we can discuss this amongst ourselves, and then we'll come back here to share our takeaways. Starting the breakout rooms now.